Hej och välkomna till Udda Ting, en podcast om sällsamma historier, kreativitet och kreatörerna själva. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller, musiken är skapad av Testbild och loggan till podden är gjord av Malmökonstnären Nalle Chinsky. Det här avsnittet ska handla om författaren Robert E. Howard. Robert E. Howard var en av de så kallade tre musketörerna i weird fiction. De två andra har jag för länge sedan betat av här i Udda Ting, H.P. Lovecraft och Clark Ashton Smith. Även om jag föredrar de två förstnämnda så är Howard intressant. Han var en otroligt begåvad författare med ett minst sagt dynamiskt språk, en mästare på att skildra äventyr och actionscener. Någon gång i 4:e-5:e klass stötte jag på Robert E. Howards noveller om Conan the Barbarian som jag tidigare bara mött i serietidningsform. Det var äventyrsspel som gav ut dem i pocketform. Äventyrsspels pocket nummer 1 och nummer 2, alltså de allra två första som gavs ut, innehöll samlade Conan-noveller. Vad jag inte visste då var att flera av dessa var skrivna, inte av Howard själv, utan av L. Sprague de Camp och Lynn Carter. När jag för några år sedan hittade mina gamla slitna böcker i källaren och såg detta så kände jag mig lurad. Speciellt eftersom jag av personliga skäl ogillade de Camp och hans märkliga förhållande till weird fiction-genren och hur han behandlade både Lovecraft och Howard i sina tidiga nedlåtande biografier. Lovecraft A Biography och Dark Valley Destiny om Robert E. Howard. De Camp var en sorts fanboy med en avundsjuka som ville hylla och förgöra sina idoler samtidigt. Lite som Robert De Niros karaktär i The King of Comedy, om någon har sett den filmen som behandlar just detta ämnet mästerligt. Mark Finn svarar på frågan om The Camp.
He really liked it in the same way that you really like something that you don't quite understand. I think it was so outside of what he normally was into, which was, math and science. And I mean, this guy was an engineer. He was a very smart man. But I just think Howard wrote stuff that he didn't quite know what to make of it. But to answer your question directly, I think he was an ardent fan of Conan. I don't think he thought much of Robert E. Howard. And I think that comes through when he spends a lot of time in his early introductions and talking about how much fun sword and sorcery is and how the sweep of it all is what takes you to different places, and that's what we want is some action and adventure. And then he starts talking about Robert E. Howard, and he says, unfortunately, Robert E. Howard was maladjusted to the point of psychosis. And that's where you go, oh, okay. That's not exactly something I would say about somebody I was admiring of. You just spent a page and a half telling me why this stuff's good and why you like it. Why are you throwing this guy under the bus? He's the guy that wrote it. I never understood that. And so Blood and Thunder, the book I wrote, was born out of sort of a need to. My intention was to explain to DeCamp that some things that he maybe didn't realize at the time, and of course. DeCamp had passed away by the time this came out. He never had a chance to read it. But I felt it deserved an answer because people kept referring to Dark Valley Destiny as the official biography until someone else comes along and does something. And I got tired of hearing that.
Hur som helst, tillbaka till de här gamla böckerna jag hade hittat och att jag då blev sugen på att läsa Howards Conan igen, fast denna gång på engelska. De var riktigt bra. Howards författartalang framstod i ett helt nytt ljus och hans talang för att skildra äventyr och actionscener imponerar än idag. Men det var inte bara action han bemästrade. Jag tänker speciellt på en scen i The Tower of the Elephant. I Tower of the Elephant arbetar sig Conan uppåt i ett högt torn för att hitta en skatt, och på vägen så kommer han in i vad som visar sig vara en sorts tortyrrum. En märklig elefantliknande humanoid varelse hänger fastspänd på en bräda. Varelsen är halvdöd av tortyren och Howard beskriver hur den utan att kunna tala människospråk berättar med sin uppgivna förtvivlade blick att den vill att Conan ska göra slut på dess lidande. Det är ett laddat ögonblick av sällan skådad kraft som är svårt att beskriva här utan att läsa själva stycket. Styckets kraft ligger också i att det kommer helt oväntat och överrumplar läsaren. Conan, som annars skiter i det mesta och mördar folk kallblodigt till höger och vänster, fylls här av en sorg och vrede av det fruktansvärda som den här varelsen utsatts för och gör slut på dess lidande. När man läser en scen som denna så blir det svårt att avföra Howard som skräpförfattare till våld och blod. Även Conan-historien växer med denna scen. Robert E. Howard levde mellan 1906 och 1936 då han tog sitt eget liv. Han var en minst sagt färgstark och excentrisk person som de som kände honom kunde intyga. Han bodde i den lilla staden Cross Plains i Texas. Och det finns en filmatisering som jag gillar väldigt mycket, The Whole Wide World. Filmen är baserad på Novelyn Price bok The One Who Walked Alone om hennes romans med Howard. Vincent D'Onofrio och Renee Zellweger spelar Howard och Price. Denna film kommer vi tala mer om i detta avsnitt om en liten stund. Tursamt nog så har jag fått tag på världens främste Robert E. Howard-kännare, Mark Finn, som har skrivit den prisvinnande Howard-biografin Blood and Thunder. Jag träffade Mark på Necronomicon 2015 när vi deltog i en panel tillsammans. Mark är supertrevlig och underhållande och det är tursamt nog han som ska leda oss igenom det här avsnittet om Robert E. Howard.
Robert E. Howard was born in Texas. He was born in Peaster, Texas, a very small town which isn't really there anymore, in 1906. And as a child, he moved around. His father, Isaac Howard, was a country doctor and spent the first probably 12, 13 years of Robert's life moving from town to town, trying to find a place where they could settle. He tried a lot of different towns that were coming into their own or booming, whether it was cattle or oil or the railroad. They finally settled in west central Texas, in the area of Crosscut and then later Cross Plains, where they would live from 1919 until Howard's death in 1936. Howard's mom was sick when Howard was at an early age. She was tubercular for most of Howard's life. She had tuberculosis, and Isaac had to leave sometimes for a couple of days at a time because he was traveling on horseback or with a buggy to go deliver a baby, on a farm somewhere. And so Howard and his mom were pretty much left to their own devices. And so she taught him how to read, and Howard was a precocious reader. He was very interested in reading at an early age. She read poetry to him. She read the Bible. She read Shakespeare. He had a really wide education at home. And so this was something that was a love of language and poetry was instilled in him at an early age. And as he got into high school, he found he had a talent for writing. His teachers encouraged him to develop it. And I think when he was 15 is when he decided what he wanted to do. He had found a copy of Adventure magazine, which was one of the preeminent pulps at the time. And it was exactly the kind of stuff that Howard liked. It was pirates and soldiers and people going through jungles and explorers and, all this kind of good stuff. And Howard, he more than once, he mentioned that it was adventure that got him hooked on, this kind of storytelling and convinced him that this is what he wanted to do. So from the age of 15 on, he had decided that he wanted to be a writer and started doing it in earnest, sending out stuff. We don't have a lot of those that survive, but we do know that he did submit early on to magazines, and at the age of 18, he got published in Weird Tales in a story called Spear and Fang. And it was a fun little caveman story. You got a kind of an inauspicious introduction to Robert E. Howard, but Farnsworth Wright liked it and bought it, and it wasn't long thereafter that Howard really started to develop what he wanted to do, which was creating characters like Solomon Kane, King Kull, Bran McMorn. These were all characters that found their way into Weird Tales and other places as well. And so he is essentially writing for about 11 and a half years straight. And in that time, he wrote over 300 stories, and as near as we can tell, close to 700 poems. I mean, it's just a ridiculous amount of material. And back then, a short story for someone was 20,000 words. I mean, he doesn't do, nowadays short stories are 5,000 words. Not Howard, man. His idea of an average sized tale would have been 30 or 40,000 words. So he wrote a lot of those, and he wrote them for years on end, and wrote in a variety of genres, as we've mentioned before. I mean, everybody's heard of Conan and maybe Solomon Kane, but he also wrote, in addition to the humor stuff, he wrote horror. He wrote some things that were added to the Lovecraft circle of writers, the people who were writing around H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos stories at the time. He wrote pirate stories. He wrote spicies. He wrote westerns. He wrote straight westerns as well as funny westerns, and was extremely prolific right up to the time of his death in 1936. But from basically age 20 to 30, he wrote and wrote until he was exhausted. Then he'd take a month off and get his battery back and start writing again. And some days he would write 12, 14 hours on the typewriter, just pounding away, sending stories. If it'd come back rejected, he'd send it somewhere else. It was an occupation. It was a life. And he blew off steam by lifting weights and exercising. He would also occasionally go down to the local ice house in the evenings. During Prohibition, one of the only places you could buy beer in rural areas was at the ice house, where they sold ice commercially for people who had an ice box at their homes. The iceman would come and cut off a block, and you put that in your ice box, and you would keep things cold. And then the ice house was also situated on the rail line, so that they could use ice to protect perishable goods and send them further down the line. And this was a way to, make things go farther. Ice was a really important initial commodity. And at night, when the trains weren't running and the iceman was done, there was this ice left over, and people would be sitting out on the dock because it's about 30 degrees cooler, and maybe decide, hey, you know what? Let's spar a little. And so maybe a bare knuckle fight would get up to going, and they'd start to punch. And then at that point, all of a sudden, magically, the beer that was hidden in the back of the ice house would come out, and everybody could drink a cold beverage or two. And so Howard fell in with those guys.
In your book, Howard talks about the violence that was all around him all the time when he grew up.
Country living was occasionally rough. People got kicked in the head by mules, and sometimes wagons would cut loose and drop things on people. And those weren't necessarily the kind of accidents that happened in urban environments. Howard was old enough to really remember two oil booms in his lifetime, one in 1921 and one in 1925, as well as the buildup to that. These were the things, I think, that had a real strong influence on him. And also, there was a 6 weeks period in New Orleans. It was during the time of the Axeman murder trials. And the Axeman was a very famous set of killings that was going on regarding immigrants, the Italians in these different neighborhoods, and the details of which were pretty lurid. And Howard, being a reader, would have read those in the paper every day at the age of 12. I think the type of stories that he was interested in and the time periods of history, he was really interested in the clash of cultures, civilizations ramming into one another. And this fed into his cycle idea, this idea that history sort of works on a wheel where, mankind pulls themselves up out of the muck, and they build great cities and walls and they make these advancements, and then they kind of reach this apex, and then they look around at all they've done, and they sit down, and then they relax, and then they they become complacent and fat, and the 7 deadly sins set in. The next thing you know, the doors to the castle kick open, and it's the barbarians who've been trying to get in, and they come in and sweep that civilization aside and start their own city where they start building things up. And, and it's this over and over cycle of boom and bust. And that is something that plays into all of Howard's historical fiction. It plays into a lot of Conan. These characters who have the ability to command and inspire and instill a sense of fierce loyalty, and all of these traits were traits that he admired.
I love the biopic The Whole Wide World about Howard and Novel Price romance. How accurate was that film?
Anytime you have a scene where Novelin is in it, whether she's alone or with Robert or with somebody else, that's a scene from the book, okay? The only scenes that they inserted into the film that were not in Novelin's book were scenes where Robert's by himself. And there is one scene that I kind of don't want to spoil for you. Let's just say there's a movie scene. There's a scene that takes place at the movies. It's a fudge on the timeline, but it's done for dramatic purposes. And if you know the scene I'm talking about, it's a great scene. But all the stuff where Robert is by himself or with his mother are scenes that were included in the film. We needed to see why Robert was late to the date with Novelin, for example. And we needed to see how he was frustrated because he knew people didn't understand what he was doing, and so I think those scenes need to be there. And do they take a little creative license? Absolutely. What we have found over the years is that ever since the film has been out on DVD, okay, or showing on the Lifetime network here in the States, which is a very a romance channel kind of a TV channel, we see almost every year 2, 3, sometimes maybe even 4 women who have shown up out of the blue, and they look very confused at all of the portly older guys in beards wearing hats walking around, because they're here for Robert E. Howard the poet. Where's Vincent D'Onofrio? We wanted to talk about the whole wide world. And everybody keeps walking up going, what's your favorite Conan story? And they go, Conan? Wait a second. It's very funny because a lot of women have come to Robert E. Howard through the whole wide world as a portal. And certainly Novelin's book, One Who Walked Alone, which the movie was based on, is without a doubt recommended reading. And one of the books I leaned heavily on, one of the books that everybody going forward has to lean heavily on, because it's the only first person account we have of Robert in the last years of his life.
Do you know if Robert had been with any girl prior to Novelin?
There's a story about Howard's friends playing a joke on him because, Howard sort of had this lofty, I don't care much for women, sort of attitude. And so they put one of their friends up to, kind of putting the moves on him just to see if they could embarrass him. And, and he turned the tables on them by kissing her. That didn't go over so well. If you read the letters, and there's evidence to suggest that Howard was not a virgin, in that he went to places in Texas along the border where there would have been brothels, and there's a period in Howard's letter writing where he gets very explicit with his poetry. It's pretty obvious what he's talking about. All Novelin would ever say was he was a great kisser. So, we're going to kiss and tell, not really. But without a doubt, Novelin was the serious one. Each of them would have probably married the other, but when he was ready, she wasn't. And when she was ready, he wasn't. They were very star-crossed in that way.
In that film, The Whole Wide World, the Robert E. Howard character talks out loud, acting his stories theatrically. Was the real Robert E. Howard like that?
Several people have confirmed that. He sort of self-dictated. He talked out loud to himself when he wrote. Of course, in the movie, he says, it makes the yarn go smoother. Well, I think it makes the yarn go smoother, but I also think that Howard was a born storyteller. He was a gifted orator, and he grew up around people who were also gifted storytellers. Yeah, and they told jokes, they spun tall tales. This was the currency of the day in Texas in the teens and 20s. It was really important that was a big social skill, being able to tell a story, out loud, tell a good joke, tell you about this guy I knew this one day, or this old boy over here, or this fella comes in the store, or however you want to start it. And if you read Howard's fiction aloud, if you go read the boxing stories, or if you read the Westerns, especially out loud, they come alive, because I think what you're getting Howard's authentic voice. And that is a crucial component to understanding Howard.
And now let me play an excerpt from that film where Robert E. Howard is on a date with Novelin, and she asks him about his character Conan that he's writing about, that she knows nothing about because she's never read any weird tales or any of those magazines. And suddenly she gets to see a new side of Robert that she has never seen before. Robert E. Howard, the eccentric storyteller.
Why don't you tell me about your character Conan?
Conan is the damnedest bastard there ever was. He's got a long black mane of hair, crystal blue eyes. He's a fighter, born on the battlefield. To him, combat's a way of life. It's all he's ever known, all he ever wants to know. He's no soldier who was taught to fight. To him, fight is an instinct. It's a part of him. Like his legs, his arms, his chest, his bull neck. Believe me, he don't take it from nobody. He'll fight man, beast, devil, or God.
Well, maybe The Whole Wide World isn't the best movie in the world. And maybe I love it because it's about Robert E. Howard. Loving it in the same way as Christian people love The Passion of the Christ because it's about Jesus. Who knows? Did Novelin Price instruct the actors how to play the parts? And did she live to see the finished film?
She was alive. She did get to see the film. She got to go to the premiere, which was very cool. And I know that Renee Zellweger met her and spoke to her about the role. I think Vincent D'Onofrio spoke to her as well about Howard and how he said things and pronounced things. So she was definitely alive during the entire filmmaking process. And she was a drama teacher for, decades. So, the kiss on the bluff with the music swelling and it probably wasn't like that, and she knows that. But I think she was very happy and very flattered with the movie, and also pleased at the fact that they had managed to get something of the person that she knew, which was emphatically not the person that DeCamp had portrayed in his book. I mean, that was the whole reason why she wrote One Who Walked Alone. She was so angry at Dark Valley Destiny when DeCamp's book came out. She was just furious. She felt she was misrepresented. She felt she was misquoted. That's when she went back into her old diaries and said, I cannot let this stand. If you think about her, that kind of firebrand kind of personality that she had in the movie, that sort of, she's not afraid to get in Bob Howard's face and tell him why he's wrong. She's not afraid to go toe-to-toe with him. It makes perfect sense that she'd go, oh, you think this book is good? Let me tell you who Bob Howard really was. I love the book for that, if nothing else.
Do you know what Novelin said about Robert?
She mentioned a couple of things. He pronounced certain words kind of peculiarly, and I don't know that they came up in the movie too much. Rusty Burke did an interview with her as well in conjunction. It was sort of after the book but before the movie, and I know some of those little tidbits made it in there. He would pronounce sword and pronounce the W, sword. And that's a very Texas thing. we tend to add the occasional vowel sound or consonant sound to certain words. So we don't wash something, we wash it. If we're going to grant someone a pardon, we don't grant them a pardon, we grant them a pardon. You know, you get the AY in there. And so I think she might have just talked a little bit about how he sounded, the way he spoke when he spoke, when he read. But she didn't give D'Onofrio too much, and I don't think D'Onofrio wanted too much. I think, you know, if you listen to the director's commentary, he talks about how, you know, he kind of had the freedom to sort of, you know, he read some of Howard's poetry to get ready for the part, and so he really got a sense of this guy's emotional core. It wasn't an exact copy, you know. We're dealing with a woman's memory that's 50 years past, and we're also dealing with something that has to be dramatized. But I think some of the scenes that to me feel the most real are the scenes at the very beginning when he's riding in the back seat of the car and the three of them are talking about stuff when Clyde's driving them around. I love the scenes where they're in public together. And, you know, there's some scenes where he's talking quietly to her, but then other times when he's bragging, you know, he's trying to make the point that he is making money in town. He is working. He's selling stories. It's just that nobody really got that, or if they did get it, you know, they didn't think it was something. It was of value, you know, and so that was part of the thing that he struggled with, clearly.
I've never read Howard's comedy stories, and for one reason. Comedies usually have a best before date. Old comedies is usually not that funny to a modern reader. That's a big difference between comedies and, let's say, horror or science fiction stories that could still hold up if they're good.
They're broad comedy. They're I would call them slapstick. Another word for it would be burlesque. You know, it's very much a lampoon of characters. These guys are cartoonish. They're larger than life. His character, Steve Costigan, is a sailor on a merchant marine. And so right away he plays into the stereotype that this guy is a boxer because sailors fight. And he's a champion boxer of his ship. So, you know, he's the big fish in a small pond. He says things like, you know, when he socked me so hard, I looked down my own spine for a second. When he mentions that level of violence, you know, you can see the guy's head spinning around, almost completely around, something from a Bugs Bunny cartoon. Half of those stories are excuses to get to the punchline at the end, you know, which is awesome. If you haven't read them, it's a very important piece of Robert E. Howard that so many people overlook because, and not without some reason, the 20-odd Conan stories have sort of filled up most of the space, much in the same way that Tarzan and John Carter overtook Edgar Rice Burroughs, Sherlock Holmes overtook Arthur Conan Doyle. You know, these characters, you know, they become part of the cultural zeitgeist. They take on a life of their own that may not be reflected in the source material, and certainly may not be indicative of the rest of the things that these guys wrote. You know, Howard wrote 22 Conan stories, including the fragments and the pieces. That's not 1/10 of his total output. Yet he wrote upwards of, he wrote over 100 humor stories if you add the boxing stories and the funny westerns together. So a third of Howard's work is humorous in nature and is only just now beginning to be looked at critically.
Do you have any favorite Conan stories?
Oh, don't ask me to. Don't ask me to. It's so hard. You're basically asking me to choose which of my children do I love the most. Thankfully, I don't have any kids, so I can pick Conan stories instead. Beyond the Black River is just so good. A lot of people prefer Red Nails. That's always up in my top 5 anyways. But Beyond the Black River just has this sort of feel to it, this vibe. I really like Conan on the Frontier as a border scout. Just fantastic stuff in the story. It's got that line, barbarism is the natural state of mankind. Civilization is a whim of circumstance. And barbarism must always ultimately triumph. Because at the end of the story, a lot of people have been saved, but a lot of people have died. And there's a new border now because the Picts have changed the landscape. And I always liked the story. And then I found out that this was based on a letter that he wrote to August Derleth, talking about the Comanche raids that used to take place in central Texas. Darned if what he describes in the Comanche raids isn't a whole lot like what happens in Beyond the Black River.
I often think of how isolated Howard was, growing up outside a small town in Texas. How did he get to read so many books?
It's funny that you could mention that, because I was literally having this conversation recently with Joe Lansdale. I've talked to many Texas authors about this over the years. I find certain truisms. It's true Howard was isolated, and there's a story that he tells. It's apocryphal. We can't verify it, about him breaking into one of the local libraries and stealing books to read. Now, whether that's actually true or not, he had trouble getting his hands on books, and he read whatever he could. He would read several newspapers. He would read magazines. He'd visit libraries whenever he could. There was a bookstore in Brownwood, which was the big city in the 1920s, and we know that he bought books from there. There was also a used bookseller named Von Blon in Waco, Texas, that he bought books from. So he did have access to some of this stuff. Here's the thing. When you're in a rural environment like this, and especially if people kind of don't know what you're doing, but they can tell you're not hurting anybody, and it doesn't really matter to them, they leave you alone. They leave you to your own devices. And so he didn't start getting a pushback on the things he was writing until he was an adult. And other adults in town were going, Weird Tales? That's one of those trashy magazines. That's one of those pulp magazines. Oh, I wouldn't be caught dead looking at any of that trash. Well, prior to this, Howard didn't have anybody telling him that. He was allowed to read whatever he wanted to read, whether it was the Bible or whether it was Shakespeare. And let's remember that Shakespeare, often pretty bloody all by himself, right? Whether it was other historical fiction, whether it was cowboy westerns, whether it was comic strips, which he was also a very big fan of in the Sunday newspapers. It all went into Howard's head at the same value. In other words, he never said, this is trash, but this is literature. And he resented people who did. He hated being told that, you have to like this because it's a classic. He really, later in school, as he was reading certain stories and poems, he had real strong opinions about some of them. He didn't think some of them were very good.
Where do you think he drew inspiration from? He was a pioneer, credited with inventing the whole sword and sorcery genre.
He drew inspiration from a lot of stuff. And we know that in the boxing stories, a lot of the boxing stories are based on not just real historical fights with actual boxers, but may have been partially based on things that he himself was involved in, because he did box with these guys. And so we know that he was a good fighter, and that he knew how to box. And moreover, when you read those stories, you get a sense that he's not just, talking through his hat. He really knows what he's talking about. His house used to overlook a field, and he could look out his window while typing and look out and see the field. I think the fields outside of Howard's house got occasionally turned into battlefields, where he would imagine, armies clashing. He drew his experience wherever he could. Whenever he traveled, he took notes, he took photographs, he bought postcards, and he would use all of this stuff in his work. Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne and Mark Twain and Bret Harte all went into Howard's head at equal value. And so if you assign a ping pong ball to every one of those things, and then they start kind of bouncing around in there, any 5 ping pong balls you pull out can make a story. And so if he was looking at a cowboy and Indian story from adventure, and he was reading The Vicar of Wakefield, which he hated, and if he was reading a newspaper article about Pancho Villa on the Texas-Mexico border bombing El Paso, and if he was reading the comic strips from the Sunday section with the Katzenjammer kids, that's why his stuff combined the way it does. That's why he's considered the father of sword and sorcery. Yeah, there were people doing ghost story historical fiction books before Howard, but there wasn't anybody doing weird elements in a historical setting the way Howard was doing them. That's why Howard gets the credit.
I've heard the correspondence between Lovecraft and Howard inspired Howard to write some Conan stories.
One of the best ones I can give you is one that was not published in Howard's lifetime, which is a shame because Farnsworth Wright didn't think too much of it. But The God in the Bowl is a very important Conan story because it's Conan's first brush with civilization. And it's a template for everything that people in power do to people who are not in power, according to Howard. You've got a barbarian who needs food. He's been promised money for food, and so he is asked to break in and steal something from this museum. And when one of the guards ends up dead, the watch is called, and Conan is accused. And there's some dialogue that's sort of right out of the conversations between Howard and Lovecraft. And one of the things that happens is that one of the guards gets a little rough with Conan and says, I'll not be spoken to that way, dog. And the guard's response is, "Oh ho! A citizen who thinks he has rights, huh? Well, we'll soon beat that out of him." And then cooler heads intervene, and because Conan's like, "All right, I'm ready to go if you're ready to die." And so, there's a halt to the proceedings while they try to figure this out. And a lot of people have missed the point of the story. The point of the story is that the most honest person in the room is the thief, Conan. He's the most, everyone else that comes in had something to do with this. Only the guard who's doing his job doesn't know who to believe. He's less inclined to believe Conan. He doesn't believe Conan's story. So his sin is making the same assumption that everybody else is, because this man's not one of us, because he's a barbarian, because he's not dressed, in a certain level of finery. He must be a lesser person. So I'm going to treat him as such. So it's all about power disparity. It certainly comes off that way in the King Conan story, The Scarlet Citadel, where they've captured Conan the King, and they're making him a generous offer. We're going to let you stay on some land over here, and then we're just going to run the country without you. And he steps, in chains in front of them, steps up and says, You're going to run the country? What have you ever done to deserve anything? Every bit of wealth you're sitting on right now was delivered to you at the hands of your fathers or your forefathers, and trust me, they fought and bled and died for it. You've done nothing except scrape off the top. This is this beautifully impassioned speech, and then he of course ends with a challenge. If any one of you would just let my hands loose, I will varnish the floor with your brains, in the way Conan does. So these conversations were being fueled by the Howard and Lovecraft letters when they were talking about barbarism versus civilization and the role of society and the need for law and order. And Howard, is laughing, law and order. The cops are on the take in Desdemona. They had to call the Rangers in because they were rioting in one of the towns nearby. What are you talking about? And Lovecraft is, well, that's never happened here. And I see, they were literally, it was literally a Mars Venus kind of a situation. They could not have been more different. And sometimes Lovecraft, I think he just really liked to argue. And I think it shows in his letters. And sometimes he would concede a point, and sometimes he would deliberately kind of twist Howard's words around to keep the argument going. When he couldn't get Lovecraft to sort of see where he was coming from or concede a point on, something else, oh, you don't see it this way? Here's a Conan story that explains exactly what I've been trying to say. That was how that worked out. And so in that regard, it was a tremendous influence on Howard, his relationship with Lovecraft.
Roberts död hade blivit något av en legend, men den mest sanningsenliga versionen lyder enligt följande. Roberts mor hamnade i koma, och när doktorn fastslog att hon inte skulle vakna upp igen så gick luften ur Robert. Han gick ut och satte sig i sin bil. Alla i huset hörde skottet. Men efteråt så drog sig familjens kock till minnes att hon hade sett Robert sitta med armarna uppsträckta i luften som om han bad till Gud. Robert hade skjutit sig med sin pistol ovanför höger öra rätt genom huvudet. Otroligt nog levde han 8 timmar efter skottet. Nästa dag dog hans mor och hans far fick helt förkrossad begrava både sin fru och sin son. I Roberts ficka hittades en lapp med texten All fled, all done, so lift me on the pyre, the feast is over, the lamps expire. Ett självmordsbrev, raljerades det. Klart att det var ett självmordsbrev. Och legenden sprang iväg på egna ben. Det fantiserades att texten skrevs direkt efter Robert fått beskedet om hans mors död, varpå han gick ut ur huset med händerna högt upp i luften, bedjande till Gud, där hela den dramatiska bönen fanns minutiöst återgiven i text. Farnsworth Wright, förläggaren på Weird Tales, gick kanske längst av alla och ljög ihop att en gammal historia som Robert skickat till honom tidigare var hans allra sista historia, och han hade jobbat på den fram till sista minuten i livet, att han skrivit klart historien för att sedan gå in till sin döda mors bädd och konstatera "It's done" och sedan gå ut och skjuta sig. När budet om Roberts död nådde Novelin Price med telegrammet "Bob Howard shot himself this morning, his mother very low", så hade legenden nått absurda dimensioner.
Even though Howard was making good money and he was making enough money actually to buy his own car, Dad was still a full-time physician. And so it fell to Howard to look after his mother. He was her primary caregiver. There's a lot of studies that talk about what happens when you have to care for a parent that long, and especially the kind of disease that she had, where it's an intimate relationship that's sort of an inversion of the parent-child relationship. You have to be the parent for the adult. You have to change their clothes. You have to clean them. It's a complete reversal, and it's very stressful. And so Howard had a lot of those stressors in his life, and in the last 6 months, they piled up and piled up and piled up until he decided, as soon as she does not need me anymore, I'm checking out. And he told people this for years, and nobody really believed him. They thought he was just being dramatic because, well, that's Bob, he's a storyteller. He sure can spin a yarn, can he? But Howard was serious. His decision is being treated a lot more sympathetically now than it was in DeCamp's day. DeCamp considered it a weakness, a failing, and he felt that it was something that was a very negative thing, an indication of a weak personality. This is, classic armchair Freudian psychology, for which DeCamp was absolutely, not an expert, nor qualified to give an opinion on. Well, all we really have are guesses because he didn't leave a suicide note, or rather, no note exists, no will exists, no note exists. So we just sort of have to go on the events that took place at that time, and we'll never know. We'll never really know. You can play that guessing game all day. My advice to fans, because there's a lot of people that love to speculate on this, it's morbid, and I think some people like car crashes more than they like the cars. My advice to anybody who wants to spend a lot of time thinking about this is there's 300 Robert E. Howard stories and 700 poems, and I know you haven't read all of them yet. So, you know, instead of wondering what might have been, let's celebrate what we got, because it's an awful lot of material. And most of it's good. And I'll tell you something else. The best of it reaffirms life. And I know that sounds kind of funny, but Howard's characters, whether they're serious or whether they're funny, whether we're talking about Conan or Sailor Steve Costigan, they don't give up. They never say die. They never surrender when they're outnumbered, when the odds are against them, when they're beaten and they know it. They never give up. That should be the takeaway when you read Robert E. Howard.
Och med de orden säger vi hej då. Det var allt för den här gången. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller. Musiken är skapad av Testbild. Hej då.